This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Ambassador Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine. They are the co-authors of the new book, Lost Decade, The U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. Roger, Robert, and Richard discuss the themes of the book, including if it is correct to characterize the pivot as a failure, the future of America in Asia, the military balance in the Indo-Pacific, and more.
Robert Blackwill, Richard Fontaine, welcome to the show and congratulations on your new book, The Lost Decade. Really exciting, the U.S. Pivot to Asia and the Rise of Chinese Power. How did the two of you arrive at writing this book and doing this project together? Was this some late night conversation over dinner in Wyoming, or did someone suggest to the two of you, you both are close watchers and experienced national security policy professionals, write a book together? How did this happen?
Well, we ran a study group together at the council on this subject, and in the midst of it, of course, as one does, we learned a lot that we didn't know about this period. And we were originally going to write just a usual 8,000-word report. But about halfway through, we decided that there was a book here. And so we proceeded on that basis.
Well, there was a book here, a really good study in terms of what happened between this period, particularly 2011 and 2021. And it begins with the so-called Asia pivot that occurred during the Obama administration, which, of course, in your mind, this was a highly consequential moment in national security policymaking, but one that never came around, which you document throughout the book. Just for our listeners and viewers, share a little bit more about the pivot, what its promise was, and what happened after the promise was made, and why it took so long to deliver, or perhaps hasn't yet to be delivered.
Well, it was an extraordinary moment in American grand strategy because for the first time in our history, an American president and Secretary of State articulated a strategy in which was not Europe first. And they did that in the fall of 2011 and asserted that the United States was now going to prioritize Asia, both with respect to its interaction with Asia, its resources, its devotion to vital national interests. And we believe that it was sincere on their part, wasn't generated by other factors, and that it was in 2011 the right grand strategy for the United States. It's important to note, however, that the consensus at the time, and the initiative was supported by both sides of the aisle, largely, was not on the basis of China's challenge to the United States. It was rather, we were still in the period of seeking to persuade China to become a responsible stakeholder. And we pursued that delusion very far into the 2010s, indeed until the Trump administration. So that was the pivot, and as you said, it never happened for reasons we'll discuss. We conclude that this omission, this lost decade, as the book title indicates, is one of the three most serious, consequential U.S. policy failures since the end of the Second World War, along with Lyndon Johnson's decision in the late spring of 1965 to escalate in Vietnam, and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. so it never happened. But the book argues it's not too late. It's more important than ever to pivot, and tries to make an argument in that regard. One last point, which is Mike Bloomberg's arm, his philanthropic arm, has a mantra: "In God we trust, everybody else bring data."
Yeah.
And we've tried in the book to bring data to fortify our assertion it never happened, and also to hopefully persuade readers that it still can happen. There are over 1,000 footnotes, and many of them with many internal indices too. So it was a very good idea, and it never happened.
Well, a lot of great data here. You mentioned the sourcing, which is exhaustive, and a lot there, and academic to the news that was going on at the time. I especially like some of the charts here. You have in terms of how the pivot didn't happen. One of my favorites is the way you document actually senior officials from administrations and their visits to the region, and how the Middle East, and looking at 2020 was still outpacing. In fact, it was on the rise compared to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, really interesting stuff here. Force presence in terms of military presence, of course, you might expect is in there too. So I thought the charts and the data were quite helpful in making the case. One of the questions I have about this, and you mentioned this in your comments, Bob, is it didn't happen, and there was more of a demand for it, more of a need for it, particularly with the rise of China. The mindset in 2011, perhaps, is that we still might be able to have a cooperative relationship with the Chinese, the PRC. That is not the case where we sit in 2024. Talk about the Trump administration and their contribution to it. And if I'm a veteran of the Trump administration's National Security Council, I might make the case or ask you the question, what about our national security strategy? What about our national defense strategy? There was a pivot in word, perhaps in 2011, but in 2017, that was a pivot indeed. That's not the perspective you offer in your book. Tell me why not.
We had great research help in finding that data, which is not easy to find and was aggregated from lots and lots and lots of sources.
I can
But
only
they do
imagine.
vivify. John Kerry, when you look at his visits to the Middle East, it's not a typo. It's not, as he chased the two-state solution.
Oh, yeah.
It is not a typo. And so we had to show the chart because people think, they surely can't remember 50 plus, can't mean that there were 50 plus visits to the Middle East Catholic.
Well, certainly those documents had a major change, which was to abandon the notion of China as a responsible stakeholder in the international system, or our policy is fundamentally rooted in engagement and the eventual transformation of China domestically and in terms of its foreign policy, and toward the embrace of a competitive relationship with China. So that is absolutely true in those documents, and that, like the pivot itself, got a lot of bipartisan support when they finally came out and said it. What they didn't do is pivot to Asia. I mean, you can look at military resources, for example, and they were not moved from Europe and the Middle East to Asia in any significant quantities during the Trump administration. You can look at diplomacy, which is kind of all over the place based on what events were happening in the world and who was Secretary of State and what was going on at the time. And of course, there was really no economic agenda whatsoever during the Trump administration. If anything, it sort of went backwards by putting tariffs and barriers in place, including with our allies. So TPP was sort of famously withdrawn from in the beginning.
Yeah, I'm going to pull the thread on both kind of two pieces there. There is some value, I believe, and no doubt you're taking this all into account in your analysis, that with the Trump administration naming the PRC as an adversary, it being the focus of the national security strategy, national defense strategy, perhaps it didn't move the forces of the United States into the Indo-Pacific. Perhaps the kind of priority of travel for the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense wasn't the Indo-Pacific. But in terms of the mindset of Americans, I think it's quite clear that in 2017, 2018, China became that adversary that policymakers, were concerned about. It kind of became the mindset of Americans. The polling reflects that. Give me your take on that significance, because clearly in foreign policy, if the domestic, population, if the legislative branch is not with you, and it's only an idea kind of that resides with the foreign policy establishment, it's not enough. You're not going to make good foreign policy. It won't be successful. Give me your take on that.
Yeah, I would just say that certainly the polls have hardened in attitudes toward China. I don't know how much you can attribute that to Americans being aware of the national security strategy and national defense strategy documents. And of course, President Trump, in his first 3 years, was not very tough on China rhetorically. He talked a lot about the trade deficit and about what he said was recessive jobs, and how he was going to get a purchase agreement from China, and they were going to buy much more American soybeans and products and so forth. It wasn't really until year 4 where the administration really took a quite hard line on China after COVID started. So I would give Xi Jinping much more credit for the hardening attitudes towards China than I would give Donald Trump or our friends who wrote these national security documents.
Let me add to what Richard said and put it in a somewhat different way. I think you're right that the national security strategy in the Trump administration articulated belatedly that the United States faced an enormous problem with China and its effort to achieve primacy in Asia and eventually globally. And that was a substantial contribution to preparing the way for an actual change in the way we conducted ourselves in policy terms. The problem is that having along with Xi Jinping's actions, created the foundation. The Trump administration never built anything on the foundation, and that was there were a series of reasons why that we could go into them, but it leads me to a broader theme, which is not put as coarsely in the book as I'm going to put it, but our failure to respond to what we call the astonishing rise in Chinese power, and that word was picked advisedly, is it raises the question of how serious a country we are, because we've recognized now for more than 5 years, and it was belated when it was finally recognized in print in the Trump administration, this enormous Chinese systematic day after day after day effort to replace the United States as the primary nation in influence and power in Asia. And we've not responded seriously. And to this day, so our rhetoric is robust, and our performance is scandalously weak. And I don't know, we have a series of prescriptions at the end of the book about how to proceed forward. But of course, it takes a president and a Congress to be willing to get past their rhetoric and spend the money and conduct the diplomacy, including economic diplomacy, in order to stop the slide.
Yeah, I think the word astonishing really comes through, and and even with some of the actions government has taken, the U.S. government has taken, it as you point out in the book, it has not come close to keeping pace with what the PRC, the People's Republic of China, have done. I'd love for you to elaborate, kind of highlights, the best examples of kind of this astonishing rise in terms of Chinese power, whether you want to talk about in economic terms, militarily, diplomatic, and then, I'd like to discuss a few of the items that have been put in place on the U.S. side, but why they don't quite get there. Perhaps AUKUS, perhaps the CHIPS Act, some other things we've done, that are innovative and significant from a policy standpoint, but clearly, I mean, you hit on them in the book, are just not quite enough. So first, what's astonishing? What are the top 10, top 5, top 2, whatever, and then the U.S. response that has really not been sufficient, even though I think over the past few years there's been something to show for it.
Let me take the first one, and maybe Richard to take the second one. On the first one, I'll be epigrammatic, but the coercive economic power of China with respect to the nations of Asia is much more than it was in 2011. Every Asian country's largest trading partner is China, and they become ever more vulnerable to Chinese economic coercion, which the Chinese exert from time to time against Australia or the Philippines or Japan or so forth. So that's one. On the military side, they've made the PLA has made these enormous strides to prepare for war against the United States in the Taiwan Straits and in the South China Sea. And in 2011, we had some prospect of being successful in that conflict. And in 2024, most of the war games show that we would have a very hard time, if not lose that. And then diplomacy, Chinese diplomacy across Asia and globally is far beyond what it was in 2011. If you look at the way they are able to generate UN votes in the third world, the way they are able to coerce developing nations votes, for example, to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where dozens and dozens of countries in the global south abstained or were absent. So the headline here is that today the United States is far weaker in its power projection and influence in Asia than it was when the pivot speech was given. So are we eventually going to get serious, or is it going to take a cataclysmic crisis, a war, for us to become serious, which of course would be a war between the United States and China, would be a global catastrophe.
Yeah. And the steps we've taken, which I think there have been some serious steps, don't meet, in your argument in this book, the sorts of things that were just described.
Yeah, so the current administration and the Congress have taken a number of important steps over the past few years. If you look at military posture, improvements and expansion of presence and posture in places like Australia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, modernizing the alliance for better operational use with Japan, foreign military financing for the first time in the last foreign aid bill for Taiwan or for Asia Pacific, or really for Taiwan and so forth. On the diplomacy, sort of bringing the Quad up to a senior or a summit level, AUKUS and other things as well. So a lot of good things. And there is a sense, I think, because we had a lost decade, that we're behind and we're in a hurry in order to try to do this, given the deteriorating balance of power in the Asia Pacific. But there's still things that we're not prepared to do as a government or as a country. So we have no trade agenda in Asia where it really matters. China's party to or to one of the Pan-Asian trade agreements and would like to join the other, CPTPP. We're party to neither and have nothing, no alternative to offer, no digital trade agreements. And then, on the military side, there need to be more resources in Asia and more resources in general. We're, as a share of GDP at kind of a peacetime dividend level that we saw in the late 1990s. So, across the board, things have been done, but not the hardest things, and the hardest things need to start being done.
Yeah, the trade agenda shows no sign of changing, whether you have a Republican or Democratic administration. It's probably the best example where the Chinese have eaten our lunch and we have no plans to do anything about it. And the other domains, Richard, as you've outlined, we're doing stuff, but maybe it's too little, too late, or just not enough to compete with the level of effort that we see from the PRC. The bookends of your book, and again, we're the authors Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine, a new book, The Lost Decade, Oxford University Press. You can go on Amazon and get it right now as you're listening to the authors speak, is a statement of grand strategy and kind of an objective. And you use almost as a straw man containment, that we can't really contain the PRC anymore, and we need something else. And I would articulate that something else, but you didn't give me one word for it. It's a sentence. And rather than me read it, why don't you share what we should be doing and what our grand strategy should be vis-a-vis the PRC, the People's Republic of China, because it's nuanced and it's not something that, at least as you argue, can be limited to, I don't know, rollback or containment. That's not what you're advocating here.
Yeah, the overall objective of our policy toward China should obviously flow from the kind of world we want to live in, as opposed to the kind of world we don't, and the way that we want to see the world ordered, as opposed to the way China would like to see the world ordered. So the overall objective of our approach should be to ensure that China is either unable or unwilling to overturn the regional and global orders. And there's various scenarios in which that might be the case, but it also implies many different things, including the buildup of our own capabilities, a highly competitive relationship with China, tighter ties to our own allies and seeing them grow stronger. And critically, because this is something of debate in Washington, it does not mean the abandonment of our commitments in other regions. China is the most important challenge in U.S. foreign policy. It is not the only one. And those challenges quite often are interconnected. So yes, that's longer than a bumper sticker. But it was a book after all.
Well, I'm glad you raised. I want to get to the allies piece in a second, but another point just raised as you're outlining what our objective is, and we're the status quo power. The way I think of it is it's an American-led order in the Indo-Pacific, and we risk losing it. And the PRC very much want it to be a PRC-led order. And we know that's not going to lead to our benefit, economic, political, and will be counter to our values. So I kind of agree with the construct there, but I am interested though in the values thread here. And you hit on that in the book, that this needs to be an important element of how we think about the PRC and our strategy. Matt Pottinger, former Deputy National Security Advisor in the Trump administration, Mike Gallagher, until recently member of Congress, who led a select committee on the People's Republic of China, both made a real full-throated argument that this is rooted in an ideological battle, which is manifest politically, economically, militarily. Where do the authors of The Lost Decade stack up against the quote-unquote Pottinger-Gallagher outlook towards the PRC and the U.S. challenge?
Well, they're both serious people, and we ought to take their views seriously. But we think the idea of, quote, winning the competition with China is misplaced, not least because they seem to define winning as regime change in China. That's how we'll know that we've won this competition with China. Well, one could first ask the probability of that happening in anyone's lifetime. But beyond that, if we express that view, our allies will not join us. And it is an issue of where should our emphasis be? Should it be on building this structure in Asia and globally, which protects our values and the practices and principles of freedom? Or should we set out to try to overthrow the Chinese government? And I would point out, correct me, you're the best possible person to correct me, is I do not believe, I worked in the Reagan administration, and I do not believe that President Reagan ever called for regime change in the Soviet Union. And in fact, he's not credited with the skill and comprehensiveness of his diplomacy regarding the latter stages of the Cold War, including with the Soviet Union. So I just think that's a fundamental mistake. We'll lose our allies if that's our objective. It's unrealizable anyway. What we learned, I think, from what happened in the Soviet Union, and it's one of the reasons I don't care for Cold War II, is that we didn't liberate Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans liberated Eastern Europe. And we didn't bring the downfall of the Soviet Union. The citizens of the Soviet Union brought the downfall of the Soviet Union. And the idea that the Chinese people are, given their history and culture, are going to overthrow their government, and that we ought to make that the pillar of our definition of winning, just seems unrealistic and unwise to us.
I just add one thing on this, which that is wholly separate from emphasizing our values, both because our values, we believe, I think all of us believe, stem from universal rights and values that all humans everywhere enjoy. But also, more pragmatically, it's a comparative advantage for us in the competition with China. I mean, China has a cramped worldview and a cramped vision of human potential and what it means for human flourishing, where the state has primacy over the individual. People are not free to express themselves or gather or speak as they would like, where countries are open to external interference and censorship if you say the things that the Communist Party would not like, and so forth. And so the United States should stand up for our values and promote them where we can. That, again, is separate from a strategy to overthrow the government in China. But we would be foolish to leave the values contest on the side in pursuit of just, well, you're either on the U.S. side or you're on the China side, and it doesn't really matter much. It only matters who you think might come out on top.
Yeah, well, I appreciate those points, Richard and Robert. That's a really good, I think, critique of the regime change, perhaps in its most potent form. I'm sure if we expanded this conversation to include a Pottinger or a Gallagher, they might perhaps articulate an approach here that is less potent, but still would be subversive in other ways, challenging the PRC in terms of what Richard just characterized as a very unnatural kind of regime in which they run, this police state, which of course denies the universal, we believe, value and right and human freedom and human dignity and the dignity of individual. From Reagan land, of course, where we come from as we host this podcast, we think of it as a sophisticated way of realizing the end of the Cold War with that was articulated in a very clear way at the outset, which is we win, they lose, right? Of course, the manner in which that was applied, not to say we have to adopt the Cold War model here as we think about the PRC, was through a very complex and sophisticated form of diplomacy, which I think you were referencing earlier. Let me
Roger,
ask you.
I
Go
just
ahead.
chime in one thing about the data in the book to fortify what Richard said. There's great detail in the book on the brutal methods by which the Chinese government is suppressing the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, and their own people. So there's no doubt that we should continue to trumpet those terrible violations of human rights that the Chinese routinely carry out, and contrast them with our vision of humanity and the future of humanity. And as Richard said, it would be a serious mistake to talk about the challenge of China only in geopolitical terms.
Right.
It's a moral question at its and philosophic at its most basic foundation.
Curious about this. I hadn't prepared this question, but because of just the course of the conversations, you brought this to mind. Hong Kong and its fall. I think it's the greatest loss of freedom in my lifetime. When I say that from the standpoint of people who were free on one day, and on the next day they're no longer free. The Trump administration, of course, has happened on quote unquote on their watch. What would we have done differently, according to the map that's kind of in your analysis here of the lost decade? What I'm assuming this is part of the lost decade, right? Hong Kong, of course. What should U.S. policy be in that scenario? I mean, there's probably a column every month talking about how that's probably China's playbook for Taiwan. And of course, you think about that, the ideological component, I would think would be front and center, certainly one of the leading ways in which we seek to counter that.
Yeah, well, so I think the Hong Kong playbook perversely has been illuminating for Taiwanese, because any notion that they had of one country, two systems, I think has been upended by the fact that China has abrogated its commitment to the people of Hong Kong and its internationally agreed commitments to the British and others during the retrocession of Hong Kong to China. And, I think the Trump administration took some steps, for example, the revocation of Hong Kong's special economic status and things like that, to say essentially, if this is going to be just another part of China, then it will be treated in our policy as just another part of China. There are other tools that potentially could have been put into place on the sanction side and things like that. But I think the most significant thing is to have Hong Kong as a wake-up call, because I think this is the playbook for Taiwan, and Xi Jinping would like to have peaceful reunification with Taiwan. Right now, he can't have it. Something's got to give, either the peaceful or the reunification. So far, it's been the reunification. But both in terms of deterring war against Taiwan, but also a sort of creeping coup against Taiwan through increased political pressure. The United States and its friends and allies should look at Hong Kong as a canary in the coal mine there.
Yeah.
Hey, can I just add to
Of course,
that?
please.
I would put it even in stronger terms. I think that there are two instances in the last 15 years, at least two, that demonstrate the unwillingness, the incapacity of the United States to react to individual episodes in ways that strengthen deterrence. Of course, I have in mind the failure of the United States and the West to react to the 2014 annexation of Crimea. And we gave Vladimir Putin a clear message, inadvertent message. And then the unwillingness, the inability, the refusal of the United States to react to the militarization of the artificial islands in the South China Sea. But Hong Kong is the third one, in which it has had the effect that Richard described. It shattered one state, two systems, and all of that bunk. So that is positive. But Hong Kong still has these international conferences where prominent Americans go and give speeches and so forth. And I think in terms of our preoccupations, we've forgotten about Hong Kong, more or less, as governments, not just this government, but the last one. And these things matter because the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians, if we think of the failure of the United States to respond when Iran attacked the oil facilities of Saudi Arabia and so forth, we are giving inadvertent signals of weakness frequently. And that you called what we argue for a grand strategy, and we hope it is that. But it has to begin with a steadfastness and a reliability and a consistency in American policies, and not the weather vane spinning round and round and round, not only between administrations, but often in administration.
During. Yeah, that's a great point. Although I would note that the rhetorical approach, the stated approach towards China, is actually the one area of continuity you can point to between the Biden and Trump administration, which makes this whole thing so much more vexing because there isn't a partisan divide over policy here, which most people would turn to as an explanation of why things aren't going well. And you're right, Bob, that it's distractions within an administration, as you've outlined, that we've discussed in this conversation. I want to hit on two more items before we get to our lightning round. We're with Robert Blackwill and Richard Fontaine, authors of The Lost Decade. Really a deep dive explanation in terms of why the United States has been unable to get its act together and truly confront the People's Republic of China. When I think about diplomacy, when I think about the most consequential visits to the People's Republic of China, and you outlined this kind of in terms of how we approach going to the Asia, right, versus other regions. But I think about who matters most when they visit the PRC from the United States. Aside from the President of the United States, I think the second most important person is not the Secretary of State, not the Secretary of Defense, but it's Tim Cook from Apple. In other words, here you have the $2 to $3 trillion market cap gargantuan company that drives so much of our economic activity and theirs. And if you wanted to truly impact this relationship, shouldn't we be looking to how someone like Tim Cook engages in his techno diplomacy? Because he goes there and he wants to make sure that they're still holding his iPhones and the stores are still selling his stuff. And it cuts against, I think, much of what you're outlining in the book. Do I have that right? Do you disagree? What do you think of that formulation?
I don't know, Bob, if you want to come in on this, but I'll tell you my view on this, which is there's some areas of obvious economic interchange between the United States and China that produce national security risk, either because they do so directly, surveillance, they're compromised, we give them capabilities they wouldn't otherwise have, or because it allows China to grow stronger in some significant way. And I think we're in a process now of identifying some of those. Semiconductors was one, and Huawei Telecom was one, and all these other things. When it gets to everything else, I think conceptually it's hard to answer the question, should this happen or not, before you tell me what the cost to Americans are. Forget the Chinese for a second. They presumably get some benefit from all of this commerce, because if transaction doesn't take place unless two sides benefit. So what is the cost of the United States to Americans? And it's only when we can actually compare the national security risk that we think we're going to buy down with the cost to Americans that would be required to buy down that risk that we can actually make that decision. And so I think the specifics matter a huge amount.
But just to clarify, Richard, I'm not necessarily advocating that Tim Cook shouldn't go to the People's Republic of China. I'm not suggesting that we should close Apple stores and no longer sell our goods into China. I want them to buy our goods. I don't take that view. But I just think that perhaps he is the more important diplomatic actor as compared to some of these other players, right?
Okay, yeah,
You look at what the Secretary of State has in his or her bag of goods, as leverage compared to what Tim Cook has. And I think Tim Cook's got more of the consequential stuff in his bag.
And so I totally agree with that, and more today than was the case even a few years ago. I mean, China's message now is we're open for business, never a better place to invest, never a time better to open your factory than here, because our economic growth has come down and so forth. And this gets back to the economic agenda of the United States, or lack thereof, in Asia. It's disproportionately important in Asia and with countries like China in a way that's not in places like the Middle East. So yes, rather than have, just our favorite, deputy assistant secretary for whatever carry the latest message, to have, major CEOs like that be on board and carry messages, I think would be very important.
Roger, could I, if I agree with everything Richard said, but I wanted to make one other point before we conclude. And it's really a point of inviting ourselves and our viewers to consider how one keeps China as our strategic priority within our grand strategy, and how one doesn't. And I mention this because, particularly in the last several months, friends of ours who we know and others, some, have proposed escalatory measures regarding our involvement in the war in Russia, in Ukraine, and escalatory measures with respect to Iran's hegemonic activity in the Middle East. And I mention this only to say the obvious, that another war in which the United States seriously engages will push farther, much farther into the future, the pivot to Asia and our capacity to compete with the Chinese as they attempt to overturn Western world order. And this is back to what every strategist knows, but Eisenhower used to talk about it. Andy Goodpaster used to write speeches for Eisenhower to talk about it, which is that the president's first priority in protecting the American people is to set priorities. And we seem, whatever the administration, to be very vulnerable to what happened last night, without pushing out the aperture to see especially how our actions might impact on our capacity to deal with China.
Well, I'd love to just harp on this one point, and it's a really strong one, but one I'd love to pursue, because my sense is that if this administration, in many respects, is so concerned about escalation, so reticent to act decisively, that what it does is that it drives the sort of behavior you're saying we should avoid. So you take Ukraine, for example. If we would have acted decisively and given them the ATACMS and the F-16s and other sorts of weapons that could have had a decisive act on the battlefield, it would not necessarily have led to the U.S. going to the war, but it very well could have resulted in the Ukrainians winning. Let's use that word, right? Similarly, I think a similar set of arguments can be made in terms of what's happened in the Middle East. Meaning, when you act decisively, it often, or has a better chance of things not becoming protracted conflicts. That's the way I look at it, as opposed to, I think, a point of view, not one that you've articulated directly, which is don't focus on those things, because you get focused on them, even if you had a decisive policy, don't do it because one, it will take away from the focus, i.e. the People's Republic of China and the challenge there, or two, we are no longer a power capable of doing our primary focus, primary priority, and still doing secondary priorities. In my mind, we are still a great power, and it is self-fulfilling if we step away from these other, perhaps secondary areas of interest, and then we just reduce ourselves to regional regional power by fiat. Richard, you're nodding, so you go ahead. Give me a reaction there.
Yeah, I mean, the abandonment of our commitments or ignoring our interests in places like Europe and the Middle East is not going to just free us up to go focus on China all day long and push all the resources there. Because at the end of the day, what happens in places like the Middle East and Europe matter a lot to Americans. They matter a lot to our economy, to our freedom, to our security. And it takes a little bit more nuance than either saying, we just won't be involved in there, or we want to avoid escalation. One of the things we concluded in the process of writing this book is in the Middle East, the narrative has spread for several years now that the United States is leaving the Middle East or was like to leave the Middle East or has left the Middle East. You look at the actual resource footprint, it barely shifted at all. It's not about how many troops we have on the ground or where the Fifth Fleet is or how many air bases we have open. It's about our performance. It's about what our policy, it's about what we're actually doing or not doing in the region. So with Ukraine, for example, as you're saying, I mean, had we given more weapon systems sooner to the Ukrainians, the ones that we eventually did give to them, and they were able to use them before the Russians dug in 2022 and early 2023, the Ukrainians would be probably in a better position now than they are today. You go all the way back to the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq in 2011. That didn't free us up to go focus on China. What it did was allow ISIS to metastasize, and then U.S. troops went back in much greater numbers for a 5-year resource-intensive campaign to fight off ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So the point is to perform and to dampen crises that otherwise would break out, precisely so that we can focus over the long run on China and Asia.
Yeah, great set of points. Let's go to our lightning round. This is where we ask our guests to share their favorite Reagan speech, book, and quote. What do you got, gentlemen?
Bob probably wrote half of these, but so he may be conflicted out of this conversation. But my favorite has always been the Westminster speech. This is in June 1982. President Reagan speaking before the MPs at Westminster in the UK, and talking about how the United States would foster the infrastructure of democracy. This echoes some of the things we were talking about before about how the United States can actually stand as a beacon on the hill and support the forces of freedom and democracy around the world. Following from that speech, it wasn't just words, followed the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, National Democratic Institute, and other things that are still in place now. So my nominee, Westminster speech, June 1982.
That's a goodie.
Let me, I don't have a speech, but I have a contrast which is related to the book. We found that when we interviewed the principals who were around in 2011 and who were both the authors and the engineers of the pivot, and said, what are you trying to accomplish? Every person answered in a different way. There was no consistency in their views of what they were trying to accomplish. And that was also, as one can see in the book, when they talked about it in public, one speech would say, we have 5 pillars of the pivot. The next speech would say, we have 3 pillars of the pivot. The next would say, we have 6 pillars. So, and often the pillars were different. I contrast that with President Reagan, who every morning when he woke up, he knew what the pillars of his foreign policy were. And the people who worked for him also knew. And there was lots of nuance about how to carry them out. But they were so part of his character, that he could not take them off like a suit of clothes. They were inside of him, and through this whole period, no president that's been in office since 2011 has taken on the Reagan-esque task of explaining to the American people the answer to the question that you asked perceptively, which is, what are we trying to do with China? What are we trying to do? And no wonder the American people are confused about what we're trying to do. And no one has taken that task on as President Reagan did in his
Robert Blackwill, Richard Fontaine, thank you so much for being on the show, and congrats on this excellent book, The Lost Decade, the U.S. Pivot to Asia, and the Rise of Chinese Power. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.